I built a company from nothing, and on Thanksgiving, I learned that someone else had been telling my story for years. The smell of roasted turkey filled my mother's house long before the first guests arrived. It was the same house where my sister Olivia and I had grown up, the same dining room where countless holidays had unfolded around a long oak table polished by decades of family gatherings. At 68 years old, I had attended enough Thanksgivings to know that family traditions rarely changed. That was why what happened that afternoon felt so unsettling. I arrived carrying a pumpkin pie from a bakery downtown and a bottle of sparkling cider my mother loved. My mother, Margaret, was already directing activity from the kitchen. At 89, she moved slower than she once had, but she still insisted on hosting Thanksgiving herself. Olivia was there too, laughing with my nephews in the living room. She greeted me warmly. Nothing about her smile suggested what was coming. For most of the afternoon, everything seemed normal. Plates filled the table. Football played softly on the television in the background. Relatives exchanged stories and memories. Several family members congratulated me on the recent sale of my company. After more than 30 years of work, I had finally stepped away from the business I had built from a rented garage and transformed into a successful regional logistics company. The sale had been featured in local business publications. It should have been one of the proudest moments of my life. Then dinner ended, and Olivia stood up holding a wine glass. The room gradually became quiet. At first I assumed she wanted to make a holiday toast. Instead, she smiled and began talking about sacrifice, determination, and the challenges of building a company from the ground up. Several people nodded along. I waited for her to mention me. She never did. As the speech continued, something strange happened. Olivia spoke as though the company had been hers. She described decisions I had made. She repeated stories from my early years in business. She spoke about obstacles she had never faced and victories she had never earned. At first I thought, everyone would notice. Surely someone would laugh and correct her. Nobody did. My nephew raised his glass and thanked Olivia for inspiring the family. My cousin praised her work ethic. Even relatives who had known me for decades seemed completely comfortable with the version of history unfolding before them. I sat there holding an untouched cup of coffee. The room felt smaller with every passing second. Olivia finished speaking to applause. Real applause. People stood. They hugged her. Someone even asked how it felt to finally sell the company after all those years. Olivia smiled modestly and accepted every compliment. I looked around the table. Nobody questioned the story. Nobody looked at me. Across the room, my mother remained silent. She was watching Olivia carefully. Not smiling. Not applauding. Just watching. And in that moment, as the noise of celebration filled the room, I realized this was not the first time Olivia had rewritten the past. It was simply the first time I had noticed how many people believed her. I stayed at my mother's house for another hour after dinner, but I barely heard the conversations around me. Relatives moved from the dining room to the living room carrying slices of pie and cups of coffee. Laughter filled the house. Olivia remained at the center of every discussion. People asked her questions about the company. They congratulated her on decisions she had never made. They praised her perseverance through challenges she had never faced. The strangest part was not Olivia's behavior. It was how natural everything seemed to everyone else. On the drive home, I could not stop thinking about it. The highway was nearly empty, and the glow of streetlights passed across my windshield in slow intervals. At first I told myself it had been a misunderstanding. Maybe people were confused. Maybe they had simply assumed Olivia had played a larger role than she actually had. But the more I thought about it, the less convincing that explanation became. This had not happened overnight. It felt older than that. Much older. When I reached home, I poured myself a cup of tea and sat in the quiet kitchen. Memories began returning one by one. Small moments I had ignored at the time. A family reunion 5 years earlier when Olivia casually told a cousin that she had helped launch my business. A birthday dinner where she described one of my biggest contracts as if she had negotiated it herself. A graduation party where she introduced me to one of her friends by saying we had built the company together. At the time I had laughed it off. Correcting her had seemed unnecessary. The details felt too small to matter. Now I wondered if those moments had been pieces of something much larger. Over the following week, I started paying closer attention. Family members posted Thanksgiving photographs online. Under one picture, a relative wrote how proud they were of Olivia's success. Under another, Someone thanked her for creating opportunities for so many employees over the years. Olivia never corrected them. She simply clicked the heart icon and accepted the praise. One evening, I opened an old photo album stored in a cabinet near my office. The pages contained photographs from the earliest days of the company. There I was standing beside the first delivery van I purchased with borrowed money. There I was inside the tiny warehouse I rented during my second year. Olivia appeared in only a handful of photographs, usually at holiday gatherings or family celebrations. She had never attended planning meetings. She had never worked weekends beside me. She had never spent sleepless nights wondering whether payroll would clear on Monday morning. Yet somehow, somewhere along the way, the story had changed. A few days later, I received a phone call from an old family friend named Susan. She had attended Thanksgiving and wanted to congratulate me on the sale. During the conversation, she hesitated before asking a question. Her tone immediately caught my attention. Susan asked why everyone kept referring to Olivia as the founder. I sat quietly for several seconds. Then I realized something important. I was not the only person who had noticed. And for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I began to suspect that the truth might still have allies of its own. After I hung up with Susan, I sat quietly in my office staring at the framed photograph on my desk. It showed the first team I ever hired. 6 employees standing in front of a warehouse that looked far too small even back then. I recognized every face. We had worked long hours together. We had celebrated contracts and survived setbacks. Looking at that picture, one thing became painfully clear. Olivia was not in it. The next few days changed the way I saw my family. Once the thought entered my mind, I started noticing things I had overlooked for years. My niece posted a message online praising Olivia for creating a business that inspired women in our community. Several relatives commented beneath it. Nobody corrected the story. Nobody questioned it. They simply accepted it as fact. One afternoon, I attended a holiday gathering organized by one of my cousins. Olivia was there. So were several family members I had not seen since Thanksgiving. I tried to enjoy the evening, but the same pattern appeared again. Someone asked Olivia how she knew the logistics industry would become so profitable. Another relative wanted advice about starting a company. Olivia answered every question comfortably. She spoke with confidence. She smiled. She accepted compliments as if they belonged to her. What surprised me most was how natural it all seemed. It was as though she had repeated the story so many times that she believed it herself. I stood nearby holding a paper cup of coffee while listening to conversations that sounded strangely familiar. Pieces of my life had become pieces of her narrative. Stories I had lived were now being told by someone else. On the drive home, I thought about our childhood. Olivia and I had always been different. I was the planner. She was the storyteller. I focused on work while she focused on people. Neither trait was better than the other. They were simply different. But somewhere over the years, storytelling had turned into ownership. The following week, Susan invited me to lunch. We met at a small diner we both loved. As soon as we sat down, she leaned forward and lowered her voice. She told me that several people at Thanksgiving had privately expressed confusion after Olivia's speech. They remembered me working weekends. They remembered me missing birthdays and vacations because I was building the company. They remembered details that did not fit Olivia's version of events. Hearing that brought me an unexpected sense of relief. Not because people were taking my side, but because reality still existed. The truth had not completely disappeared. Before we left, Susan said something I could not stop thinking about. She asked whether my mother had spoken to me since Thanksgiving. I told her she had not. Susan nodded slowly. Then she said she noticed Margaret watching Olivia during the speech. Not with pride. Not with admiration. With disappointment. That single observation stayed with me for days. My mother had said almost nothing that evening. Yet the more I thought about her silence, the more significant it seemed. For the first time, I began to wonder whether she knew exactly how this story had started and why it had been allowed to continue for so long. The question about my mother stayed with me longer than I expected. A few days later, I found myself driving to her house on a cold December afternoon. The trees along her street were bare, and holiday decorations had begun appearing in neighboring yards. Her house looked exactly as it always had. White shutters, small front porch, a wreath hanging on the door. For a moment, I almost turned around. Part of me was afraid of what I might learn. Another part was afraid that I would learn nothing at all. My mother answered the door wearing a pale blue sweater and invited me inside. The smell of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. We sat at the same table where Thanksgiving dinner had taken place only weeks earlier. At first, we talked about ordinary things. The weather, Christmas shopping, a neighbor who had recently moved away. Neither of us mentioned Olivia. Eventually, my eyes drifted toward an old staircase leading to the attic. I remembered spending hours up there as a child. Boxes of photographs, school projects, family keepsakes, pieces of our history carefully stored away. My mother noticed where I was looking. She smiled faintly and asked whether I remembered the old storage trunk. I did. It had belonged to my father. Without another word, she told me I could look through anything I wanted. A few minutes later, I was standing in the attic surrounded by decades of memories. Dust floated through thin beams of winter sunlight. Cardboard boxes lined the walls. I opened one container after another. Family vacations, birthday cards, old report cards. Then, near the back corner, I found something unexpected. A small wooden box labeled with my father's handwriting. Inside were photographs from the earliest years of my business. There were pictures I had not seen in decades. Me standing beside my first office desk. Me signing paperwork. Me unloading inventory from a truck. The dates were clearly visible. What caught my attention was what was missing. Olivia appeared nowhere. Not in the office. Not at meetings. Not at company events. The photographs told a story far different from the one she had been sharing. Beneath the photographs sat a stack of documents. Business licenses. Newspaper clippings. Letters of congratulations. Everything carried my name. As I sorted through them, a strange feeling settled over me. It was not anger. It was confusion. How had such obvious facts become so distorted within our own family? When I returned downstairs carrying the box, my mother looked at it for several seconds. Her expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. She knew exactly what I had found. I sat across from her and asked the question that had been growing in my mind for weeks. Why had she remained silent at Thanksgiving? My mother wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and stared out the kitchen window. Several moments passed before she answered. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but heavy with regret. She said there were things about Olivia that I did not fully understand. Then she quietly added something that made my heart sink. The story had started much earlier than I imagined, and she had been watching it grow for years. My mother's words followed me home that evening. The story had started years ago. Not months. Not recently. Years. I replayed the conversation over and over as I sat in my living room staring at the wooden box resting on my coffee table. Outside, Christmas lights glowed across the neighborhood. Inside, I felt as though I had opened a door to a part of my family's history I had never fully understood. The next morning, Susan called again. This time, she asked if we could meet in person. We chose a small cafe near downtown. The kind of place where people lingered over coffee and nobody rushed you out of your seat. When I arrived, Susan was already there waiting. She looked unusually serious. After we exchanged greetings, she reached into her purse and removed an old photograph. The edges were worn. The colors had faded. It showed a business luncheon from nearly 20 years earlier. Several local entrepreneurs stood together in a hotel ballroom. I immediately recognized myself near the center of the picture. Then Susan pointed toward Olivia. My sister stood near me smiling for the camera. Susan explained that shortly after that event, Olivia had begun introducing herself to people as my business partner. At first, everyone assumed she meant emotional support. Family support. Nobody thought much of it. Over time, however, the description changed. Business partner became co-founder. Co-founder slowly became founder. The transformation happened so gradually that most people never noticed. I sat quietly listening. Susan told me she had corrected Olivia several times in those early years. Each time, Olivia laughed it off and called it a misunderstanding. Then she would repeat the story again somewhere else. Different audience. Same narrative. Eventually, people stopped questioning it. The explanation sounded disturbingly familiar. Small distortions repeated often enough can begin to resemble truth. Before leaving, Susan shared one final detail. Several years ago, she overheard a conversation between Olivia and a distant relative. Olivia had openly admitted that people remembered stories better than facts. At the time, Susan assumed she was joking. Now she was no longer sure. On my drive home, I thought about everything I had learned. The evidence was growing. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet one question still remained unanswered. Why had my mother stayed silent all those years? Later that week, she called unexpectedly and invited me over for lunch. Her voice sounded different, more determined. When I arrived, she already had several photo albums spread across the dining room table. We spent hours turning pages together. School events, family vacations, holiday gatherings. Then she opened an album I had never seen before. Inside were photographs from my earliest business years. Tucked between the pages were handwritten notes from my father. He had carefully documented milestones and achievements. Every entry mentioned me. None mentioned Olivia's involvement. My mother traced her finger across one page and quietly said she should have spoken sooner. Then she looked directly at me and revealed something that changed everything. Years ago, Olivia had asked her to support the false story. Not publicly, not directly. She had simply asked her not to correct it. And for reasons my mother deeply regretted, she had agreed. For several days after that conversation, I found it difficult to think about anything else. The fact that Olivia had spent years reshaping the story was troubling enough. Learning that my mother had known about it made everything more complicated. I was not angry with Margaret, at least not in the way I expected. What I felt was sadness, deep sadness, because I could finally see the cost of a decision she had made decades earlier. She had believed she was keeping peace within the family. Instead, silence had allowed a false version of history to grow stronger with every passing year. The week before Christmas, I visited my mother again. Snow had fallen overnight, covering her neighborhood in a thin white layer. Inside, the house felt warm and familiar. We spent the afternoon sorting through old family records. My mother seemed determined now, almost relieved, as though she had carried a burden for far too long and was finally ready to set it down. One box led to another, then another. We found newspaper articles about the company, award certificates, letters from local business organizations, even old tax records and incorporation documents. Every piece pointed to the same reality. The company had always been mine. The evidence was not dramatic. It was ordinary. That was what made it so powerful. Facts rarely need to shout. They simply exist. As we worked, my mother began sharing memories she had not spoken about in years. She told me Olivia struggled when we were younger. Not financially, emotionally. She often compared herself to me. When I received awards in school, Olivia felt overlooked. When I started the business, Olivia worried she would never accomplish something equally meaningful. My mother admitted that she spent years trying to protect Olivia from disappointment. Looking back, she realized that protection had become permission. Small exaggerations were ignored, then larger ones. Eventually, nobody challenged them at all. Late that afternoon, we uncovered a folder neither of us remembered. Inside were several handwritten letters from my father. One letter had been addressed to my mother. Another had been written shortly after my company reached a major milestone. As my mother read it aloud, the room became completely silent. My father described how proud he was of the risks I had taken. He praised my determination and resilience. Then he wrote something unexpected. He expressed concern about Olivia's growing habit of presenting herself as part of achievements that belonged to others. The letter was more than 20 years old. I stared at the page for a long moment. My father had seen the problem long before anyone else. More importantly, he had documented it. My mother folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the folder. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Outside, snow continued falling. Finally, she looked at me and said she intended to correct her mistake. I asked what she meant. She answered with a level of certainty I had not heard in years. The family would be gathering again after Christmas. Everyone would be there. This time, she said, there would be no more silence. As I drove home that evening, I realized something had shifted. For weeks, I had been collecting fragments of truth. Now the truth was beginning to gather its own momentum. And for the first time, I believed the story Olivia had spent years building was closer to collapse than either of us had imagined. The days between Christmas and the family gathering passed more slowly than I expected. Every morning, I found myself looking at the stack of documents on my dining room table. Photographs, letters, business records, newspaper articles, pieces of a story that had existed all along, waiting for someone to pay attention. I did not spend that time planning a confrontation. I spent it remembering. The first office I rented was barely larger than a storage room. The first delivery truck had nearly broken down during its first month. There had been years when success felt impossibly far away. Yet somehow those difficult years now seemed clearer than recent events. Facts are easier to remember than fiction because they do not need constant maintenance. Fiction must be protected, repeated, reinforced. The truth simply waits. A few days before the gathering, my phone rang. Olivia's name appeared on the screen. I stared at it for several seconds before answering. Her voice sounded cheerful, casual. She asked about holiday plans. She talked about family. She mentioned the upcoming gathering as though it were just another ordinary event. Then she laughed about something a relative had posted online. A message congratulating her once again for building the company. She laughed and said people never forgot a good story. The comment lingered in the silence between us. I wondered whether she realized how much that sentence revealed. I responded politely and ended the call a few minutes later. Afterward, I sat by the window watching snow melt from the branches outside. For the first time, I stopped asking myself why Olivia had done it. The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was understanding how many people had accepted the story without question. Later that week, Susan stopped by my house carrying a small envelope. Inside was a copy of a local business magazine published nearly 20 years earlier. An article featured my company during its expansion years. There was a photograph of me standing beside the new warehouse. The caption identified me as founder and president. Susan smiled when she handed it to me. Another fact. Another piece of reality. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just evidence. The evening before the gathering, my mother called. Her voice was steady. She told me she had gathered everything she wanted to bring. The letters. The photographs. The records. Then she said something I had never expected to hear. She apologized. Not with excuses. Not with explanations. Simply an apology. I sat quietly holding the phone while she spoke. When she finished, neither of us said anything for several moments. Some wounds do not disappear because someone says they are sorry. But acknowledgement matters. Truth matters. The next afternoon, family members began arriving at my mother's house. Cars filled the driveway and lined the street. Laughter drifted through the front door. Everything looked normal, familiar, comfortable. Yet beneath the surface, something had changed. I noticed it immediately when I stepped inside. My mother seemed calmer than I had seen her in years. Olivia moved confidently through the house, greeting relatives. She looked completely at ease, completely certain. Watching her, I realized she had no idea what was coming. And as the family settled into the living room and conversations filled the air, my mother quietly placed a small wooden box beside her chair and rested one hand on its lid. The gathering unfolded much like every family event before it. Coats hung near the front door. Children moved between rooms carrying plates of cookies. Conversations overlapped from every corner of the house. Olivia seemed especially comfortable. She sat near the fireplace, surrounded by relatives who listened eagerly as she told stories about business, leadership, and perseverance. Several details sounded familiar because they belonged to my life. Yet nobody interrupted her. Nobody questioned her version of events. I watched quietly from across the room. Years earlier, I might have felt the need to defend myself. Now I simply observed. The truth no longer depended on my ability to argue. It existed with or without anyone's approval. As the afternoon passed, I noticed my mother saying very little. She remained in her chair beside the wooden box. Occasionally someone would ask whether she was comfortable. She always smiled and assured them she was fine. But her attention never drifted far from the people in the room. She seemed to be studying everyone. Waiting. After dinner, family members gathered in the living room for coffee and dessert. The atmosphere felt warm and relaxed. Someone suggested sharing memories from past holidays. One by one, relatives began telling stories. Then Olivia stood. The room naturally grew quieter. She thanked everyone for their support over the years and spoke about the importance of family. Several people nodded along. Then she began describing the company again. She spoke about sacrifices, difficult decisions, long hours, challenges overcome. The same familiar narrative. The same borrowed history. I glanced toward my mother. She remained perfectly still. Olivia continued speaking for several more minutes before finally raising her coffee cup in a toast. Applause followed. Smiles spread across the room. Then something unexpected happened. My mother slowly stood up. The applause faded almost immediately. At 89 years old, Margaret rarely interrupted family gatherings. When she spoke, people listened. She thanked Olivia for her remarks. Her voice was calm, gentle. Then she said there was something she needed to share with everyone before the evening ended. A quiet uncertainty settled over the room. My mother placed both hands on the wooden box and lifted it onto the coffee table. I noticed Olivia's smile weaken slightly. Several relatives exchanged curious looks. One by one, my mother removed items from the box. Photographs, letters, newspaper articles, business records, carefully preserved pieces of history. She arranged them across the table without saying much. The room grew quieter with every item she revealed. Nobody seemed to understand where this was leading. Then my mother picked up a letter written in my father's handwriting. She looked around the room and took a slow breath. For the first time all evening, Olivia appeared uncomfortable. She shifted in her seat and glanced toward the documents spread before everyone. My mother unfolded the letter and prepared to read. At that moment, I realized the years of silence were finally ending. Whatever happened next, the story my family had been told for decades was about to meet the story that had actually happened. My mother adjusted her glasses and began reading. Her voice was steady, but the room was completely silent. The letter had been written more than 20 years earlier. My father described the early days of the company in remarkable detail. He wrote about the long hours I spent working. He wrote about the risks I accepted when success was far from guaranteed. He wrote about the pride he felt watching me build something meaningful through persistence and determination. Then he addressed a concern that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. He mentioned noticing a pattern in Olivia's behavior. Not anger, not jealousy, something quieter. A tendency to attach herself to accomplishments that were not her own. My mother lowered the letter and looked around the room. Nobody spoke. Several relatives leaned forward in their seats. Others stared at the documents spread across the coffee table. Then she began presenting the photographs. One by one, images from company events, early offices, business meetings, community awards. Every photograph told the same story. I was there. Employees were there. Clients were there. Olivia was almost never present. Next came business records, incorporation papers, newspaper articles, public announcements, years of documented history, facts preserved long before anyone imagined they would someday need defending. My mother did not raise her voice. She did not accuse anyone. She simply allowed the evidence to speak for itself. The effect was far more powerful than any argument could have been. Across the room, I noticed expressions beginning to change. Confusion, realization, embarrassment. Family members quietly compared documents. Some reread newspaper articles. Others studied the photographs more carefully. The story they had accepted for years was beginning to unravel. Eventually, my mother turned toward Olivia. The room seemed to hold its breath. Margaret spoke gently. She explained how years earlier Olivia had asked her not to correct certain misunderstandings. At first, those misunderstandings seemed harmless. Small exaggerations, minor distortions, but each one made the next easier to accept. Silence became habit. Habit became belief. Belief became family history. My mother admitted her mistake openly. She said she had confused peace with honesty. In trying to protect one daughter from disappointment, she had failed to protect the truth. No one interrupted her. No one challenged her words. When she finished, the room remained quiet for several seconds. Then something happened that I had not expected. Several relatives turned toward me. Not dramatically, not with pity, simply with understanding. For the first time in years, they were seeing the full picture. Olivia looked down at her hands. She did not argue. She did not deny the documents. The evidence was too clear, too ordinary, too real. I felt no sense of victory, no desire to embarrass her. What I felt instead was relief. The weight I had been carrying since Thanksgiving finally began to lift. The truth had not changed. It had simply been buried beneath repetition. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. The gesture was small, but it said everything words could not. As conversations slowly resumed around the room, I looked at the photographs scattered across the table. They represented years of work, sacrifice, and perseverance. They represented reality. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by family, I realized something important. Success was never the thing that had been taken from me. Recognition had been. That night, both were finally returned.